any later. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for connecting today to this webinar on the social impacts of misinformation, which is organized by the Division for Inclusive Social Development here at DESA. My name is Fernanda, and I'm pleased to welcome today's expert speaker, Jay Van Bavel. He's a professor of psychology and neuroscience and director of the Social Identity and Morality Lab at NYU, New York University. Jay's research examines how collective concerns like group identities, moral values, and political beliefs shape the mind, the brain, and behavior. Along with multiple academic articles, he's co-authored the book, The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. Today, Jay lends his expertise to covering the topic of misinformation and its social impacts for this webinar, informing the preparation of the World Social Report 2025. Please keep in mind that there will be an opportunity for Q&A after the presentation, so please send in your questions via the Q&A box or the Q&A function at any moment during the presentation or as we begin the Q&A section. So without further ado, Jay, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here today. I'm going to talk to you about the science of misinformation and a little bit about what we know about what seems to work and what we can do about it. Of course, this is kind of a new area of research and we're learning about it all the time. But the reason that we're trying to figure it out is because it's a pretty terrifying situation. I will give you some data on, what are the risks and downsides. But first, I want to show you this image. It's kind of like captures it to me that, we have classically the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, pestilence, and death. And in recent years, it feels like there's a new one. On the far right, over here, you see the new fifth horse of the apocalypse, horseman of the apocalypse, misinformation. Checking out, an iPhone, which is what most of us do much of the day. In fact, the average person spends over 3 hours a day on social media. And there are nearly 5 billion people around the world online. And so if there is a misinformation problem and we are consuming like this, through this, it becomes a huge part of our information diet every day. People are scrolling. If you have a 6-inch phone like this, scrolling down 600 times, that is a total of 300 feet, or the height of the Statue of Liberty. And so that's how much information we're consuming online. And it's had some weird effects. This is one of my favorite tweets about it. This guy, Ben Rosen, said, in 1990, scientists were saying things like, we cloned a sheep, we landed a robot on Mars. Scientists today, for the last time, the Earth is round. And so the types of things, the conversations that scientists are having, and I will say I've been to many scientific conferences, people are panicked about this because it seems to be that people are more misled about more important things than ever. In fact, there was a recent survey by the World Economic Forum, which got over 1,000 experts from around the world to predict what they thought were the biggest problems that the entire globe was going to face in the short term and the long term. And in the near term, over the next couple of years, they said misinformation and disinformation are the single biggest threat to humanity around the globe. In fact, they rated them a higher than extreme weather events from climate change and societal polarization and conflict. You could argue, of course, that one of the reasons misinformation is bad is because there's been a long history of misinformation about climate change that makes it harder to solve. Misinformation is spread easier when there's divided societies and polarization. And it leads to things like cyber insecurity because it allows, bad foreign actors to mislead us and threaten our democracies. It also can foster interstate armed conflict by spreading lies and false stories and narratives about people. And so a lot of these core threats that humanity is facing are related to misinformation. They make it worse, and they're made worse by misinformation and disinformation. And then even if you look 10 years hence, other than basically the problems of climate change, misinformation is still seen as the other biggest threat that humanity faces. So it's something that we're all trying to understand and wrap our heads around and figure out how to fix it. The biggest circumstance in which we've seen this in recent years, where it literally cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives, was during the global pandemic. And so the term that was coined by the World Health Organization to describe the tsunami of misinformation was called the infodemic. So just like a pandemic spreading around the world, there is a misinformation problem spreading around the world. And how that looks in the modern information environment is like this. One person has some bad idea or conspiracy theory about what's happening. It spreads out to other people, and then they spread it to other people. And then if you're lucky enough and some people double check their facts, they might stop spreading it. But everybody who's not doing a proper fact check is spreading the misinformation. And so even if some people are getting their news from trusted sources, in the United States, that tends to be places like the Center for Disease Control or mainstream media that's fact checked. If they're getting it from these alternative media sources that have misleading or misinformation, they're going to keep spreading it. And other people, a small number of other people, think they're going to be fact checking it or not spreading it. But as you can see, over time, it's quickly spreading to more and more people, even if some of them are minimizing it and trying to flatten it. And so this is a problem because it's just like COVID, where it spreads as it gets further and further from the original source. In fact, there was a study a few years ago in 2018 in Science magazine, and they analyzed millions of shares on social media. And what they found is that fake news spreads faster than true news on Twitter. And it was thanks to people, not bots, because there was a period of time where we thought it was mainly bots, artificial intelligence, foreign actors spreading misinformation. But a lot of it is actually, most of it is spread by people. And they found that tweets containing falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted than untruthful tweets. And there was another huge study that came out recently, a couple weeks ago, on anti-vax misinformation and misleading information. And they find that, again, misinformation is even more likely to be spread than misleading information. However, there's even a greater pool of misleading information, which might be technically true, but is designed or intended to deceive people. And so those two things are working in tandem to spread all kinds of false narratives about the state of humanity, and they're incredibly dangerous. This study, when they try to figure out why people are spreading it, they found two key factors. One is that misinformation was spreading faster and further if it was about politics, so it was connected to people's identity and their moral values. And the other thing is if it was emotional. And so those are the two key factors that determine the spread of misinformation, where it really went viral. And these were things that were fact-checked to be false. That's how they measured it, and those were the types of things that were spreading. This was something from a news study that came out a few weeks ago. It was a study on TikTok. So now TikTok is one of the biggest news sources for young people in the world. It also is a major spreader of misinformation. So this new study found that fully 20% of the recommended videos on TikTok's news topics contain misinformation. And when they looked at like the big one of the moment, which is lies and misinformation about COVID vaccines, that was 50% that contained misinformation. So for some topics on the biggest platforms in the world, the top topics are loaded with misinformation, in part because misinformation tends to be super engaging. It's interesting, it's provocative, it's often political, it's emotional, it challenges the narratives and leaders and the mainstream media, so people think that they're in on something special if they're hearing these conspiracy theories. So it's very appealing to people and generates a lot of engagement. And the whole social media ecosystem runs on what's called the attention economy. What that means is they're making the 5 billion people are going on each day, including me. We are generating revenue for these companies if we spend a lot of hours online on these platforms, because then they sell us advertising. But how do they keep us online? They keep us online by keeping us engaged. And it seems like misinformation and conspiracy theories are one of the big things that can keep people engaged. You actually saw this just a couple of days ago when in the United States, President Donald Trump was shot. If you had logged on to social media platforms, there were so many conspiracy theories flying around. A lot of them had little or no evidence whatsoever. You saw this also when the Queen of England, Princess Kate, she's the princess of England, and she got cancer and disappeared to the public eye, but people spread endless malicious conspiracies about her. And for many people, it was just fun. It's fun to spread these. It's fun to talk about them. It's fun to joke about them. It's fun to shred somebody's reputation based on conspiracy theories. And so there's a huge incentive structure socially, and it seems to be amplified on these platforms because they their algorithms are designed to amplify things that are engaging. And so they're going to amplify more misinformation if they do that. Now, the problem with that is that we're on this massive platform, and I'm going to show you a little video here of my favorite chimpanzee. And you can see this chimpanzee is watching social media. This is an Instagram feed. They've shut up with videos of the chimp. Oops, sorry. Oh, I lost the video. Sorry about that, but there's a chimp flipping through videos. And what you realize is that the chimp flipping through these videos is a lot like us. Chimps, in fact, share over 99% of their DNA with humans. They're one of our closest evolutionary ancestors. And it reminded me of this quote from this great evolutionary biologist, E.O. Wilson, who said, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, like our friends the chimp. We have medieval institutions, and we have godlike technology. And it is terrifically dangerous, and it is now approaching a point of crisis overall." This was before social media and misinformation. This was before 5 billion people were plugged online each day for 3 hours, breathing this in, taking this in as their information diet, letting it change how they think about the world. And we just do not have the institutions to deal with this. We don't have good regulations about social media. We don't have good solutions for misinformation at the policy level. So what my lab has been trying to understand is, well, at least maybe we can understand these Paleolithic emotions and how they interact with this technology. And so this was some research that I did with my student, former student Billy Brady. He's now a professor, and Molly Crockett. And what we were thinking of is very much like that infodemic image I showed you a few slides ago, which is that people are online, they read something or see it, and it triggers them to think about it and respond. And then they share something. They either reshare it, or they add a comment about it, or quote it, or cut and paste it and share it with their own thoughts. And the things that we're seeing of those 600 swipes down our phone each day, we're seeing so much stuff that the only stuff that really seems to pop out and grab our attention in what we found in our research is things that are moral or emotional. And when you see those things, they trigger a feeling often in you, often a feeling of outrage or anger. That seems to be the biggest one. And that's what motivates you to perceive it in the first place, and for it to capture your attention, and then for you to do something about it. Because if you're outraged, you're more likely to do something about it. You share it. And a lot of the stuff that's outraging you is in part designed to outrage you. There are people who make huge profits creating content and misinformation that is designed to trigger your emotions, to manipulate you, to get you to click, to get you to stay online. It's a massive manipulation machine, and it's hugely profitable, not only to the companies, but all kinds of influencers. They're making money hand over fist, manipulating people, triggering their emotions, and getting them to click, follow, like, subscribe, and spread information. And a lot of them don't care if the information's true. In fact, if they find out that false information is going to get them more money, then that's what they're going to create more of. And if that's the thing that seems to trigger people, which we're finding with more and more research, then that's the type of content you're going to get more and more of. And when they spread that, it has a cascade effect, almost like when you drop a pebble in the middle of a pond and it ripples out throughout the entire pond within a few minutes. That is the power of this spreading technology that we've created. And we've created what we call the MAD model, because it's getting people mad and it's exploiting their feelings of anger. And the factors that seem to be working in unison here to get people to spread misinformation and polarizing content is things that motivate you, often things that are threatening to your identity. And this can be a political identity, this can be a national identity, a religious identity. I see it a lot with generational identities. I see people criticizing boomers or Gen Z. Or I saw two women arguing back and forth about complaining. One was complaining the other was a Gen Z with bad morals. The other was complaining the other person was a millennial with bad morals. And in reality, they're just two people. They might not represent their entire generations at all, but each of them was using the labels Gen Z and millennial to criticize an entire generation of people because it got them more traffic, it got them more likes, it got them more attention, it got them more comments, it got them more followers. If they have a blog or they're selling books, it's making them more money. And so but meanwhile, they're angering all of these poor people who see this and think, wow, I'm being attacked because I'm a Gen Z and this person is criticizing people like me and I don't do this thing, or this is unfair, or this is false. And same with millennials. And so this is the dynamic that you have on social media of constant criticism. And when you see this when you see a criticism, think, is this fairly targeted at an entire group, or should it be narrowly targeted at a specific person or a small number of people? Because when they use those labels, they're stereotyping an entire group, often of hundreds of millions of people, and smearing them publicly. And so that's the dynamic that gets people mad. Now you have that dynamic and people's emotions getting triggered and their identities feeling threatened. And then that's what grabs attention. That's what drives engagement. People see that. I stopped and looked at it. They click on it. They make a comment. They share it. They defend their group. They attack the other group. And then all this is happening in a system that is designed to keep us up online on their platforms as long as possible. They make the maximum amount of profit by keeping us hooked online. And so they want to amplify this. And if they see a lot of people, that the algorithms are designed to, if they see a lot of people commenting on things like that, they show more of it to everybody. One of the things you could click on Facebook, which is the biggest social media platform in the world, is that angry face button, kind of like this little trigger that I show on this slide. That angry face button seems to be the single most engaging thing. When people are seeing news that makes them angry, then they click on the anger button more, and then it pops up in people's algorithms more, because Facebook has designed an algorithm that if people click angry, they're going to show it to even more people in their network and connected to them. And so this is the trap that we're all caught in. It's kind of like a very negative vortex that we've been going down, and it seems to be just spiraling down over time. Now, I'm complaining about social media, but I understand social media can be incredibly good. So social media can be a force for change, a force for truth, a force for giving people voice who don't have it. One example of that was in 2017. This is what happened when the hashtag #MeToo was shared. It was started in the United States by some celebrities who were sexually harassed and sexually assaulted, and they were finally giving voice to those experiences that had been suppressed, hidden, covered up. And you can see it spread around the world, and it started a conversation about the mistreatment of women in many, many countries. And this was just within 12 hours. You can see all the countries that were engaged in that conversation just on that one platform. And so this allows us to have global conversations instantly about really important things. And Me Too is something that has changed institutions around the world. I'll just say, in academia, I've seen professors fired because of their history of sexual harassment that they had gotten away with before. And all of a sudden, women were not going to hold back anymore. They were going to voice their concerns and do it publicly. We saw major members of the media and Hollywood go down, members of all kinds of the most important, powerful industries that had people in power, almost always men, who had just a history of decades of sexual harassment and assault. And it changed rules and laws and practices and policies and behaviors and norms. And so these things can be a great force for change. So I don't want to argue that. I also will say another example. I hosted a conference on threats to democracy a few years ago around my book. And I met Pastor Ewan Magwari, who was a pastor in Zimbabwe. And he talked to me about how he had used social media, in particular Facebook, as a pastor under one of the most authoritarian, corrupt, violent regimes in the entire world. And he had spoke truth and criticized that government. And other people could see it because he posted his videos and his criticisms on Facebook. And it led to a whole movement in the country and an uprising and an overthrow of the dictator. He can never go back now. That's why he's here. He's basically at risk. He speaks for the Renewed Democracy Initiative. And he's paid with his freedom in many ways. He's not allowed to live the life he was living before in the country where he's from and his family's from, because he criticized the government and tried to make it better. But the only way he was able to do that and get people all in the same wavelength about the injustices was by social media. So social media can be incredibly powerful for giving a voice to people who've been oppressed, victimized, have struggled in all kinds of ways. So it does have a positive side, of course, just like any technology. So we've been trying to study this just to understand it from a scientific perspective with an eye towards, once we understand it, maybe we can learn how to harness it for good and figure out better ways to suppress the downsides, like the spread of misinformation. How can you give people a voice without fostering violence and conflict? And so the way we started on this was our first paper in 2017 on social media, led by Billy Brady and Julian Wills, who are PhD students in my lab at New York University. We wanted to study three big topics. that were kind of in the news at the time in the United States. And we got a sample of over 560,000 messages from social media on the issue of gun control, which is very polarized here, same-sex marriage, so rights for people who are gay and lesbian to marry, and climate change, which was a big issue then and continues to be a massive issue and is highly polarized around the world. And this just gives you a sense of the type of words that appeared in the climate change data set. The bigger words appeared more frequently. And so we got these huge samples of language and messages. And then when we looked to see what spread, what messages spread, we found that when people use moral emotional language, especially like this language associated with outrage that I was telling you about before, it led to messages going viral. So for every moral emotional word you put in a message, it was 20% more likely to spread. And so you can see this for all three topics we studied. The more and more moral emotional messages you had, the spread went more, the messages went more and more viral. And so if you put like 5 or 6 messages, 5 or 6 moral emotional words in a message, it was twice as likely to get shared. So that's 100% increase. If you just put purely moral words, it did not spread. So if you put words like just, something's justice, or fair or even, those are not words that agitate people and trigger them emotionally. You need words like, I hate them, I fill me with contempt, I am so disgusted, or I am in love, like with the same-sex marriage, it was right around the time that right was granted by the Supreme Court in the United States. And so a big hashtag around that time was love wins, hashtag love wins. And so positive moral emotions can also spread. They're very also motivating for people. And so these are the types of emotions. Usually it's bad, but sometimes it's good. These moral emotions is what spread. But when we looked at what was happening and who was spreading it, we found data that looked like this. We were able to figure out if each person was more on the left wing or right wing of politics based on who they followed and who followed them. And what we found is that when people were using these moral emotions, then the messages were only getting shared by people like them. So people on the left, liberals, were sharing more messages by people like them. And there was not much crosstalk or cross communication or sharing or amplifying of messages from people who differ than you. And likewise, if you were conservative, you were only sharing messages that were conservative if it had moral emotions. Whereas if you were talking about the exact same topic, but you were not using this language, there's more crosstalk. And what we found is that when people use moral emotional words, in other research, we found that just the moment you use a single word like that in a message about politics, it makes people who agree with you like you more, and people who disagree with you see you as very close-minded and they don't want to engage with you. And they see you as a hyper-partisan, a very extremist politically. And so what happens is when the way we use our language sends a signal out into the world about where we stand on things and if we're open-minded or closed-minded. And so it's a double-edged sword. This language can help you mobilize people like you to spread the message, but it can alienate people who are different than you and make it harder for you to connect to them and persuade them. And so when you're writing your messages, you have to think very carefully, am I trying to mobilize people like me who already agree with this? Or am I trying to speak to people who might be different from me and help them understand that I have an open mind and see if we can connect and I can get through to them? And so these moral emotional words can go viral, but they're also linked to polarization. And then when we looked also, that was on Twitter, but we also analyzed Facebook data. As I was telling you, we found similar patterns. This was led by a postdoc in my lab, Steve Rathje. And what he found in almost 3 million messages on Twitter and Facebook, that the single biggest thing that predicted whether messages spread and generate engagement was the angry face. So when you saw news from political leaders or from news sources that triggered this anger face, that was what was spreading the most. And he found also that each term in a news post that referred to the political outgroup, which almost always were negative messages, increased the odds of a social media post being shared by 67%. So this is the single most powerful thing we found to determine what messages go viral. It is, if it is negative news about another group, then people like you will share it. And so this creates a really perverse incentive structure. It means that these media websites and political leaders have a greater and greater incentive to share more and more negative content about the other group. And there was a recent paper that found that over time, political leaders are posting more and more hostile and incivil content on social media, in part because it's rewarded. And those rewards have gotten steeper over time. So this is leading our political leaders to foster more and more negativity and conflict with people who are different than them and groups that are different than them. So this is a really terrible situation, and it seems only to be getting worse given all the data we have. It is not getting in a better direction. We have also created a dictionary, scientific dictionary of language associated with polarization. This was led by a visiting student who collaborated with me, Almog Simchon and Billy Brady. And then we have also looked at like how polarization is linked to things like public health and misinformation. And what we found, for example, when we compared the United States social media networks to the United Kingdom, we found that in the United States, it was more polarized. There was more of a difference between the left and right in people who are talking about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy on social media than there was in the United Kingdom. There was actually more crosstalk and it was less polarized. And what we found in the United States is that certain prominent political figures seem to be connected to most of the vaccine misinformation. And a lot of them were spreading it to create content or amplifying misleading information or negative information about vaccines. And in the United States, there was a study that found that the lack of vaccinations, largely from people not thinking it's unsafe due to misleading or misinformation, killed at least over 300,000 people. And so that's just the consequence in one single country of this polarization and spread of untrustworthy information around vaccines. Because if you make people hesitant and scared and distrustful, then they're not going to get the necessary medical procedures. But that not only hurts them and increases their chances of mortality or death, but it increases the probability they're going to spread it to members of their community. And those people might not agree with them or disagree with them politically, but they're getting exposed because those people aren't taking care of themselves and minimizing their own risks. Here's just an example of some of the people in the United States. If you follow American Dynamics, this is a very popular podcaster, Joe Rogan, and Candace Owen is also a popular social media kind of right-wing influencer. But you also see things like Donald Trump Jr., who just spoke at the Republican National Convention last night, versus like Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, were in the opposite. People who follow them trend to trusted vaccines. People who follow these individuals did not trust them. So for these extreme individuals, only 27% of their followers on social media actually plan to get vaccinated. We also found using our polarization dictionary that when people were talking about COVID on social media, if they were using polarized language in their discussions about it in certain places in the country, it predicted the gap in beliefs between people on the left or the right. And so if you were polarized in your discussion online, a few days later, you were just as likely to be polarized in your beliefs about how risky it was. And this correlation was huge. This was a massive correlation of 0.67, which you very rarely see. And so this suggests it's not guaranteed because it's correlational data. But the pattern suggests that these online conversations are spilling over into our judgments of the real world and may make us take more risks. So in other studies, we have found that places that are highly, leaning towards these distrustworthy beliefs that were highly partisan and supported Donald Trump in particular, people there were less likely to engage in social distancing, more likely to get infected, more likely to die, less likely to get vaccinated. And so all of these things tend to go together, these misleading beliefs and false beliefs with all of these public health things. We have also found that agents of foreign influence, like these are Russian trolls, they have been using more polarizing language online over time. And so their goal is to create division. And we have looked at this in many other countries, and they seem to be using this language more and more and more over time, much more than regular citizens use it. And so part of their goal is to just cause conflict in countries and make it harder for those people to come together in a shared view of reality. This has spilled over. This was probably the biggest threat to American democracy in over 100 years. All of these people were told that the election was stolen and they invaded the US Capitol. This was some of the people who invaded it violently. I teamed up with the New York Times, which is the major news source in the United States, and they used our polarization dictionary to look at the language of American political leaders. And what they found is that from 2012 to 2022, they've seen more and more polarizing language. And in particular, what they found is that the political leaders who voted to overturn the election, in other words, these are people who objected to the results of the Democratic election, were the ones using most of this language on their social media profiles. So even other members of their party who voted to uphold the election were not using this degree of polarizing language. And so this seems to be an indicator that people have lost trust in their institutions. They are believing misinformation, and not just believing it, they're literally going to the government to vote on the basis of misinformation and to overturn an election. And so this shows you how tightly linked polarization, corrupt leadership, and misinformation are. This quadrant right here reveals that in a really powerful and terrifying way, because if more of them had voted that way, they could have potentially actually disrupted the election. And that might have tipped the country into violence or even a civil war if they had refused to uphold the election. So that is the level of danger that countries face when they're dealing with this. We have been trying to understand more why this is. And the way that we think of it psychologically is kind of like people, have an opportunity when they go to the newsstand to read something that is fiction or nonfiction, just like you can buy a book, fiction or nonfiction. But when you're encountering something in the world, you're trying to make a decision. Is it fiction or nonfiction? Because sometimes you don't know. And when people are doing that, they're using their values to determine it. And if they value things like accuracy, which I value, I'm a scientist. My goal is to be as accurate as possible and always update my beliefs and my theories based on evidence. Then I care a lot about making sure I make a good decision about what's fiction or nonfiction, and making sure I'm reading my data accurately and talking about it and sharing it accurately. On the other hand, people who are connected to political parties, or these could be also religious groups, national identities, other sectarian identities, we are humans. And we don't always, and our groups don't always care about accuracy. We care about being moral and virtuous. That's a big part of a lot of belief systems. We care about fitting in and belonging. That's one of the most fundamental needs humans have. We are a social species. We care about, having high status, that our group is better than other groups. And when we care about these things, it motivates us to believe things that might not be true if they give us a sense of belonging, if they give our group a sense of status, if they make us feel virtuous, among other things. And so when they encounter something and they're not sure if it's true or false, they want to believe things that make them feel good about their groups and their sense of identity. And so if it looks good for them, they'll consider it nonfiction. If it looks bad for them, they'll call it fiction. And this is why you see some politicians, when evidence comes out they did something corrupt, they'll immediately say that's fake news. Don't trust the media. And politicians have been doing that for decades. And what they're trying to do is convince their followers not to believe what they see with their own eyes. They're trying to convince them, don't trust those people who are telling you these things. Of course, this is not just politicians. This is also famously what cults do and cult leaders do. They're constantly trying to convince people to believe something to uphold the cult and give their money and resources and trust the cult, not to trust other pieces of evidence, because a lot of times the last thing on earth they care about is accuracy. They care about controlling people. And so to control people, you have to fulfill these needs for them and convince them things that aren't true. And that is often what many, especially the most underhanded politicians, try to do. And so we have a mathematical formula for this, and we've been studying it. But the key thing here is people have these goals because they're part of different identities. How can we motivate accuracy goals? And so in the math equation, if you can get accuracy to have a higher value for them, to have more weight than all these other goals combined, then you can get people to be accurate. Or if you can have them have identities that value accuracy. So for example, as a scientist, if I share misinformation or I get caught engaging in scientific fraud, my status will plummet. I will no longer be invited to dinners. People will not want to stand next to me in a photograph. I will stop getting invited to talks like this, because I will have done a bad job in the group that I'm in because we care about accuracy. Many groups care about accuracy. And so if you get caught spreading misinformation in those groups, it can be very damaging to you. But if you care about accuracy, either as an individual or because the group you're in values it and has norms that reward it and protect it, then you'll care about accuracy. So our goal is to figure out ways to get other people, regular citizens, to care more about accuracy and see if that can stop them from believing and spreading misinformation. And so we've done a few things. I'll just say 3 things that we've done in various research projects. We have tried to incentivize accuracy. We have given people money to be accurate and look to see, does that change their belief in true news and get them to share more accurate news? We have tried to align their identity with accuracy. What happens if we can communicate to them that members of their own group don't find something accurate? Will that mean they'll be less likely to share it? And then the other thing we try to do is create more inclusive norms and identities where people feel part of an identity and they don't feel like they're at conflict anymore. And does that reduce their need to spread misinformation? And so I'll just show you, this is from the first 4 experiments that we ran on motivating people to be accurate. Again, this was led by my postdoc, Steve Rathje. And again, all these papers are on my website at jayvanbavel.com. You can go there and download all these papers for free. What we found is that when you just give people $1 to spread accurate information, we found that they could do it. So in the control condition, people were not very good at telling the truth. But the moment that we gave them $1 to be accurate, they were much more accurate. We also found that they were less partisan. They were less likely to spread information that aligned with their own group. So giving people simple little financial incentives can be all it takes to get them to be more accurate. We found that these simple, small financial incentives increased people's accurate news beliefs and reduced their partisan bias by 30%. So you can reduce polarization. This means that people, no matter what their political party is, suddenly are more likely to believe in the truth and believe in the same thing. When we looked at what they were sharing, we found that when they had a goal to be accurate, again, just $1, we found the biggest effect was because they were suddenly able to see that news from the other party was accurate. They were suddenly open-minded to facts that came from people different than them, from outgroup members. And so that seems to be what's doing. You're paying a little money and people are motivated to open their minds to a reality that they might not otherwise have trusted. And so that's what's happening when you're giving them this incentive. Of course, this was a monetary incentive. We gave them $1. In another version of the study, we gave them a social incentive. They said, this is what people value. Try to, build your reputation by spreading true information. And we found very similar results. So you can have an economic incentive to be accurate, and it works in all of these ways with really big effects. Or you can have a social incentive to be accurate, and it works almost as well. We also found this wasn't just a matter of your skill in cognitive reasoning. Some people think, well, it's only if you're good at reasoning and you have sophisticated reasoning skills, you can tell true from false news because people are just lazy. And we honestly didn't find any evidence for that in all of these studies, which were large pre-registered studies. And so what this suggests is anybody can do this if they're motivated to do it. Assuming it's, the news is simple enough, as long as they're incentivized, they can actually correctly believe and spread accurate information. In another study, this was run by a postdoc of mine. She's in Spain, a former postdoc, Clara Pretis. She's now a professor there. She wanted to look at how we could change the design features of social media to get people to spread more accurate information. And we looked at what was being used on social media, and there were things like fact checks. Like you'd be told something was misleading if it was spread by a politician and it was wrong. This was old on Twitter before Elon Musk took over. Now they have community notes, which actually work pretty good. So if you're told something is misleading, it's fact checked. That is very popular. That's the single most popular thing that we have in most realms of society. Another thing that was very popular in our research area was an accuracy nudge. So you'd see something by a politician and you'd just be reminded, to the best of your knowledge, is above statement accurate. So if people are just lazy, maybe you could just give them a little nudge, simple, to get them to think more critically about it, about whether it's accurate or not. And so a lot of research has suggested neither of those work very well. They work, but the effects tended to be pretty small. And so we thought, well, if we think this is about their identity and the norms of the groups that they belong to and fitting in, then maybe we could create a different type of intervention that might be more effective. And we also thought there's a problem with things like fact checks, because it requires often an army of people fact checking things who are experts, who are trusted to keep up and then constantly be updating. And sometimes those are controversial. And so we thought, what if you could crowdsource this? What if you could just see, do other people find it misleading? Other users. And so we tested out this misleading button. So at the time, you would not just see the retweets or likes for a message, you would also see how many people thought it was misleading. And then we also manipulated whether it was people like you who thought it was misleading, because presumably people, and the research shows this over and over again, norms are important for the groups that you care about. You don't really care about fitting in or having the same beliefs of people you disagree with. People care more about fitting in and sharing the beliefs of groups that they care about, of people like them. And so we just tested what happens if we added a misleading button onto these posts. And what we found is this was very effective. Simply adding this misleading button reduced the spread of misinformation by 25%. So that's very good. That's 1/4. We also found it was 5 times more effective than the accuracy nudge, which has been quite popular and used by big platforms. And so we thought, if we design these interventions, we don't only want them efficient and scalable, but we want them effective. And so the best way to have them effective is to build them off the best theory about what psychologically are people actually responding to. This intervention was also great because we found it worked especially well for polarizing content, whereas most fact checks actually work very badly for polarizing content. Because it's polarizing, so people don't trust fact checkers. But we found it works especially well, in part because if it's people like you, and so therefore you trust them more. We found it worked for Democrats and Republicans. We found it worked people on the left and the right in the United States and the United Kingdom. And it worked best if it was tagged by people like you, your members of your in-group. Then the effects were even bigger than if it was just misleading reports by anybody. So this suggests that there are powerful, scalable ways that we could, in theory, build these into platforms, and we would love to. Of course, we don't control how platforms are designed, unfortunately, but it gives us at least some hope. And it suggests that our theories are on the right track, because we're finding these things are working in really good samples. We're finding they're better than other interventions that are out there. And we're finding they don't have a lot of the same downsides, like not working for polarized misinformation, which, as I pointed out repeatedly, is a lot of the source of misinformation, and it's a lot of the worst misinformation. And so if we want to build a shared reality based on accurate beliefs, we have to build it on the science of understanding what does it take to motivate people to believe and share something that from people different than them. And again, we study a lot of this in politics, but theoretically, the same principles apply to people from different national groups, different religious groups, different sports fans, different generations, from Gen Z to Gen X to millennial to boomers. Well, there's all kinds of these cleavages in society, divisions around all kinds of identities. If we understand how identity works, we can be more effective at countering misinformation. Also going to give you, I've been working on other tools with other experts to fight misinformation that aren't just based on the research I showed you here. So one of the big ones that seems to be leveraging trusted sources helps counter misinformation. So for example, if you can get a lot of people that are trusted, like a bunch of doctors, family doctors can weigh in, that might be effective. The research suggests it is. I'm going to show you some other evidence we've collected that shows it works. If you can use misinformation correction strategy with tools that promote healthy behaviors, like these incentives and norms I've been showing you, these things seem to work very, very well in all the research we found. Other things you can do that I haven't shown you about in my research today, but I want to highlight that there's a lot of other research on them. Avoid repeating misinformation without at least including a correction, because research finds that if you just repeat misinformation over and over again, people are more likely to believe it. You need to debunk misinformation often, and again, you need to debunk it repeatedly. So over and over again, people learn that it's false. Another thing that's proven to be very effective is pre-bunking misinformation. So it's almost like you take an inoculation, like a vaccine, to prepare your body for encountering a virus. You do that with pre-bunking. You give them the truth and explain why they're going to be manipulated. And so by the time they encounter the manipulation and the misinformation, they are prepared to react to it. They have skills and resilience. And so you want to train that. You want to do that for all kinds of misinformation people might encounter before they encounter it. That seems to be very effective at stopping them to believe it. And then I think the other thing we need is more collaboration with social media companies. I already told you we've had some solutions that work that are more effective than what's out there. But it would require a big social media company for us to collaborate to work with us, or regulations or policy changes for these to actually make a dent in this, because there's so much misinformation being said every day about all these issues. You're going to have to develop better design on these platforms. If you want to learn more, this was what's called a consensus report with a handful of experts, about a dozen experts in misinformation. I was just one of them. It was commissioned by the Center for Disease Control and the American Psychological Association. But it talks about all these individual level things I've been talking about, psychology, and also we talk about literacy, how to train people up to detect misinformation, these social norms and nudges, and accuracy incentives. But it also talks about the need for these system level changes. We're going to have to combat polarization and bad actors, bad leaders, because they're the ones exploiting it and puts us all at risk. You're going to need better legislation. You're going to need better business models in technology. You're going to need better algorithms that don't amplify things that are engaging, even if they're misinformation. And so you're going to have to think about all of these changes if we want to fight this problem. I also want to say that I've been working, this is with a foundation, a nonprofit called the Clarity Foundation, and it's with medical experts. We've been trying to fight misinformation. And what we did is we tried to use one of these strategies about consensus. And so we surveyed anonymously a bunch of family doctors who are involved in infectious diseases. And what we found is we just asked them all anonymously if you thought COVID vaccines are safe and effective. And what you can see is 99% of them agree on this. And then we shared this. And this is very much like the model that climate scientists have done, because in the past, climate scientists would tell you how bad climate change was, and then a TV station would bring them out and then put them against someone who was a skeptic and let them debate it. And that was terrible, because at the time, something like 97% of climate scientists agree. And there's only a small number of skeptics. But the moment you put a skeptic and an expert side by side, it creates the illusion to the viewer that the issue is actually 50-50, that it's divided and there's a debate and there's conflict. And so you have to be careful not to debate these people who are cranks. For example, if I go on TV and I debate someone who thinks that the earth is flat, if I'm a scientist and I go on, it gives credentials to the person who is a flat earther. It makes them look like they have a legitimate argument that I would spend my time going and arguing with them. And maybe they're just really good at arguments and really persuasive, even if they don't have evidence, and they can trick people or persuade people who are watching who don't know better. And so it rewards the types of persuasive strategies that aren't yoked to actual science, and it creates an illusion that there's an actual debate when there's not one. No self-respecting scientist in the world thinks the earth is flat. And so when you start to look at these with vaccines, and you look at these doctors who are working on the front lines with families trying to help them, and 99% of them say these are safe and effective, that is a really powerful signal to people, because they trust their family doctors, even if they don't trust government officials. And so these are ways that we've been trying to get expert opinion and share it without, also it doesn't put these individual doctors at risk, because if you have experts go out, they will get harassed. And I have been harassed before for debunking misinformation. I had 1,000 messages trying to harass me. I had people contacting my university to try to get me discredited or fired. They harassed my wife. They harassed my kids online where they could find them. These people are very unethical. They will harass you to shut you up and also to help build their conspiracy. And by the way, if you fact check them and you're an expert, that is evidence in their minds of the conspiracy. Oh, they're trying to cover it up. They're trying to hide it. And so even a fact check for many conspiracy theorists is something just in their mind confirms and amplifies the conspiracy theory. So even engaging with some of these people is very dangerous. There's a lot of threat and risk that comes with it, and it's hard to get through to them.
Okay.
Okay, so this, by the way, if you want to learn more about the Clarity Foundation, which is our nonprofit that works on misinformation, you can go to www.clarityfoundation.com or just take a screenshot of this. I encourage you, if you're interested in this issue information, if you want to help or collaborate, or we're interested in working with other countries and teaming up with other organizations, contact them. I'm not in charge of it. I'm just the science expert on the team. But please reach out to them if you're interested, and they would love to team up with you on this fight for misinformation if you want to fight it in a practical sense. Okay. So with that, I want to thank my lab. This is the Social Identity Morality Lab. We're also building at NYU, from my lab, a Center for Conflict and Cooperation. So if you're interested in working with us on these issues, supporting research or applying the research in the real world, please reach out to us. Here is my personal website, jvanbavel.com. Oh, I actually put a dot in there. It's just jvanbavel, one word.com. Sorry about that. Or if you want to learn about my book, and we have a free newsletter about these issues. We write about global issues, including misinformation, conspiracy theories, climate change, other things, social media, other things we're studying at a global level. You can go there. We write a weekly free newsletter for anyone who's interested. And we also have a subscriber thing if you want to learn more and meet with me privately about these things. But check out those websites. And please, if you're interested in digging deep dive into this, please do check out my book, The Power of Us. I talk about all of these things and how to make groups healthier. It's based on 20 years of science. And it talks about all this research and many more. If you want, get it from your library for free. It will give you a quick overview of all the research we've done and kind of what you can do to make a dent in making the world a little bit of a better place. Okay, I'm happy to take questions in the last few minutes. I'm not hearing very good, so I'm going to stop my sharing. And I'm going to look at the webinar chat first and try to respond to any questions. And then I'm going to open the Q&A. So please do post your questions in the webinar chat and then in the Q&A, and I will go through and answer them for the next few minutes. Okay. So I shared my papers. Okay. Marta says, thanks for this very interesting talk. Misinformation seems to find more fertile ground. Example, have more political and social impacts in some countries than others. Why is this? Are disparities in the use of social media the only driver in these differences? First of all, this is a great question. I think there's lots of things going on. I think some of it might be social media and how it's used. And in some countries, I will say, social media has been used for far worse things, including for genocide in Myanmar and other countries. And what researchers and journalists have found, some books that I've read, is that a lot of those companies don't even have moderators, or only one or two moderators overlooking an entire country. And so they might be moderating way more content in the United States. And so what we might be seeing in the United States is actually way better than what we're seeing in other countries. So that is one problem, is there's not an investment from some of these countries, and there's not regulation around it. And there's big regulatory differences across countries. And so that is one issue. There are other issues. So one of the big spreaders of misinformation classically is state propaganda. Some countries are controlled by dictators or authoritarians, or they ban social media for the opposite reason. They don't want the truth to get out. They don't want people to know what's going on in the wars they're conducting and the ways they're mistreating people. They don't want dissent. And so in some countries, it's actually mainly the government that is spreading misinformation, and they're suppressing people's use of social media so they can actually talk and coordinate and organize and spread accurate information. So that's another thing I want to be clear is it looks like social media is actually most helpful in countries where there's not actually a healthy democracy. Another question is, curious to know what strategy do you use to create more inclusive identities? Yeah, I didn't have time to get into all our research, but what we do is we usually try to create superordinate identities where people feel all included in something bigger than themselves. And this can include an organization that you work with. This can include a country that you belong to. This can include a global sense of global citizenship, that we're all in this together, and it's going to take all of us to fight some things like COVID or climate change. And if we all don't cooperate, we're not going to solve it. And so there's various strategies. And again, I have a whole chapter in my book based on this. So I encourage you to check it out if you want to learn more about that. Okay, Colleen asks, what sort of work can we do with the Clarity Foundation as researchers? So if you're a researcher and you're interested in Clarity Foundation, get in touch with them. David Sweet is the CEO. He's a doctor and a researcher at University of British Columbia, and deeply passionate as time. He will be happy to meet with researchers. He's looking to add people to the board of directors. He's happy to learn about your research, figure out ways to share it, maybe team up with you, anything he can. He's super open-minded and enterprising, and basically just trying to build a coalition of people sharing all their insights to help fight misinformation. So please reach out to him. Next question. Thank you so much for a great presentation. Do you think these misinformation sharing patterns will be the same for AI-generated content? And how do you think we can mitigate these? Yeah, so a lot of people are concerned about artificial intelligence because it can generate artificial misinformation at scale, like deep fakes and fake images, like instantly. And we're studying AI in my lab right now. I will tell you one interesting thing. We're studying AI across the globe. We just got a grant from Google and did this huge project led by a postdoc in my lab, Laura Globig. And what she's found is that actually the people who are most excited about AI and find it aligns the most with their needs and values are in the global south. They're in places like Indonesia, and less in places like the United States or the UK or Germany. And so she has found that there's actually huge cross-cultural differences. It actually seems to be more collectivistic context that people actually are enjoying AI. We're trying to figure out why that is. Is it individualism and collectivism? Or is it something about how their industries and those individuals benefit because the productivity gap gets reduced and they benefit economically? So we're not 100% sure. But there are some upsides to AI, like everything, and there's big cultural differences again. The other thing that we're finding, there's some promise with AI. So there's a great, I criticized the accuracy nudge, but the same people who created that actually have this really exciting new research to debunk conspiracy theories, which, as I said, are very hard to debunk. And they use AI. They trained an AI to talk to people who are conspiracy theorists and slowly walk them down and give them factual information in a way that like they can digest. So that paper is not published, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's the most promising thing I've ever seen for fighting conspiracy theories. And so now we're trying to use similar things to like get people to talk across differences, to learn more about their political systems, to mobilize young people to vote and get more politically involved and care about democracy. So we just submitted a grant on that this week to do research in that space. So I do think AI is promise. But there's also an issue that there's a lot of elections going on around the country in this year. And there's a huge risk. There's going to be a huge creation of more and more convincing AI content. My biggest concern about it, I'll say this, because I just wrote a paper. We had a whole section on AI and its downsides and upsides, led by Valerio Caprero, who's a researcher in Italy. And you can get it on my website as well. And the thing we think about AI is, and my concern is that it actually might make it harder for people to tell real from true news because it can make really convincing fake news. And that's a problem because a lot of our interventions, like the accuracy nudge, only really works when people can easily tell the difference between true and false news. If AI makes it almost impossible to tell true and false news because it's so convincing, then a lot of our interventions aren't going to work. So that's the other big concern, is it will be overwhelming, and it might then just make us distrust everything as a default. And so it can make us really skeptical of real news. And so there's a huge amount of risks about how people approach misinformation, also if our interventions stop working, and also our just general distrust, which is a bad thing for society. Okay, 2 more questions, and then I'll cut it off there because I know people have to run. How do you view the perspective of researchers like Hugo Mercier, Sasha Alte, and Dan Williams, who argue that fake news and misinformation are more symptoms of underlying causes rather than standalone problems? I think they're partly right. I think it's a bit of a straw man to say they're more symptoms than just standalone problems. They're both. They are symptoms, as I've tried to say, of things like polarization, that I try to say in a couple parts here, that becomes a vector for the spread of misinformation. It makes people susceptible and want to believe it because their motivations change. And so you make people susceptible to misinformation based on these psychological as well as technological problems. And then, of course, once you have misinformation, it amplifies polarization and conflict. And so we need to stop thinking about these things as either or, and we need to think them as interactive, dynamic systems. And that's very much how I've been trying to present them here and think about them myself. And that's how most people think about them. So I do think there's a little bit of, I do think their criticisms are reasonable, and I agree with most of them. But I also think they're overstated, and they tend to straw man perspectives that don't agree with them, because most people I know would just say, of course. So it's kind of like a criticism that everybody agrees with. But it's a good one. I guess it just doesn't get emphasized enough. So I think that in that way, sometimes criticisms in science are helpful just for making sure that the implicit assumptions a lot of us have are fully fleshed out and made explicit. And so I think in that way, it's been very helpful, extremely helpful. Okay. Oh, Remy's on the call. How you doing? Remy's going to be joining my lab as a postdoc in a couple months. So we just found out this week. So you can check out his research on his website. Okay. So based on your research, what would be your top recommendation for policymakers? Would it involve constraining social media platforms? Yeah, I think like that would be one thing. I think one thing that terrifies me is when the CEOs of these tech companies get called to meet with Congress and Senate, the questions they often have are not very well articulated, to put it delicately. I think a lot of the very senior members of Senate maybe don't use the technology in their day-to-day life and maybe don't fully understand the dynamics of it and how bad actors use it. So I often worry that legislation will be forever behind where people are at. And I know there's a good argument against legislation. It was in this great book called The Chaos Machine, or sorry, The Hype Machine, by Sinan Arel, who's an MIT tech researcher, and very convincing to me if you read his book in his last couple of chapters. So I think policy is going to be really hard. That's why I don't want to like come too hard down on what the policy would be. But I like to think of like you could make changes in the platforms immediately that would help mitigate the spread of misinformation, or at minimum, we want to try them out. The biggest policy I'd like to see is that researchers get this information, because what has happened under Elon Musk when he took over X, he got rid of a lot of his staff who cared about public safety and misinformation. And he also throttled researchers' access to data and made it way more expensive so that we can actually study what's going on. And we can't tell you, the public, what's going on, because the public deserves to know, and they deserve to have experts telling them who are not paid by these companies. Because if company representatives are telling you they have a conflict of interest. And then the same thing is happening with Facebook. In a couple of weeks, they're about to cut off access to CrowdTangle, which is one of the main sources that researchers use to analyze Facebook data, the biggest social media platform in the world. And so I think at minimum, you need transparency and access for researchers so that we can share what we find. And so that then the public can debate it, you can have deliberative democracy, and then policy at least can be based on evidence, not based on like our guesses or based on random examples. So I'll wind it up there and say I don't have a full solution, but at minimum, we need to know. So thank you so much. Again, please just check out my website to learn more, follow our newsletter for our lab or for my book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. Do you hear us?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jay. We do have thank you to everybody who has stayed 5 minutes past time. We do have a couple of questions on the Q&A box that I don't know if you saw. If you have a second.
Okay, let me stop share. I can quickly look.
Yeah.
And see if I can
read
put
them out
oh,
too.
okay,
If you can
I had to stop sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me see if I can answer these. Where do you see anonymous? Where do you see the opportunities for future research in mis and disinformation? I mean, I see a ton. I think it's grown into one of the hottest research areas. I've seen it go from nothing to all the top journals are having special issues on it now, including Nature had one a couple weeks ago. That's the top science journal in the world. So there's a ton of stuff. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of different theories. We're just about, I'm a co-author on a paper that it was a mega study pitting a bunch of different theories and interventions against one another. That's going to be, we're going to submit that to a journal soon. I haven't really had a chance to edit it, but I've seen the data. So I think there's going to be more things like that. I think we need more of a global research initiative. A lot of this research is in America and Western Europe, like unfortunately, most research is. So I think we need more funding and collaboration that's at a global scale on this. And I think we need more like large scale intervention style tournaments, because a lot of researchers have their own baby theory and they love it and they just run a million studies on it and constantly try to prove over and over again that that's the best solution. But they also have a bit of conflicts of interest. So I think you want studies that pit a bunch of interventions together, that use the most rigorous approaches, open science and so forth. I do think they need to be theory driven. One of the critiques of this research area is that there's not always a lot of theory. A lot of it's very focused on practically how can we stop this? And we're ignoring sometimes 50, 60, 70 years of theory in the social sciences. So I think as we're bringing that in, it's getting stronger and the interventions are working better. I think there's more need for collaboration with tech and tech, like for example, synthetic social media platforms, which we're trying to figure out how to use right now, and field studies. There's more need for that. So you can see how this works in the real world. Does it change real behavior? And then I also think there's a lot more need for interdisciplinary collaboration. Everybody from computer scientists to sociologists should be part of the conversation. I've been to some cool conferences on that recently. Developmental psychologists too, education experts, psychologists, political scientists. This is kind of an all hands on deck moment. Okay, I see another question. Is misinformation going to wipe out history? I think, that's like a dystopian scene from 1984, which is one of my favorite books. resonates during this misinformation age. I don't think it's going to wipe out history, but I always think there's going to be motivated people, propagandists who've always been around, motivated to rewrite history and misrepresent history. This happens all the time politically. So I think like you need tools to preserve history. You need platforms. One of the great ones is Wikipedia, where there's like moderators who have, work hard to create real public knowledge that's high quality. So we've also created platforms and incentive structures that do that. So I don't think it's going to rewrite history, but I think there'll be a constant effort by bad actors to pervert it and mislead people about it. Marissa asks, thank you for bringing together so much research in the midst of all these situations. Is there any study underway or carried out on what different groups do to share identity and resolve differences outside of social networks? I will say there's one big project. I submitted an intervention myself, another massive intervention tournament. It was just run in the United States, so take it with a grain of salt for other political systems. But it was designed to reduce partisan animosity, and we created a common identity. Again, it was based on that chapter of my book I mentioned, and that was the third best intervention out of 252 that were submitted. The other ones that were better on it was kind of letting people know that the media misrepresents them. And the best one was about showing healthy intergroup contact between people who were politically different. I'm about to launch a project. Well, I'm a minor author on this one. This is led by Paulo Boggio's lab at Brazil. He's launching, go to his website, he's launching a global study around the globe to test these interventions to reduce conflict and polarization. And so I'm really excited to be collaborating with him. Our center is teaming up with his center that he's developed in Brazil. And it's nice to have it led by a country in the global south. And so he's put together already a team in the last couple of weeks of hundreds of collaborators. So if you're interested, ping him with an email right away. And his student is leading it, or his postdoc. So we're looking to see what will be the most effective. So we're testing, data. Michelle asks, do the people who check the accuracy of information face some kind of negative social network effect? Yes, they do. They get harassed, they get trolled, they get doxxed. So this is a terrible thing. I did an interview on it with American Psychological Association. You can search Jay Van Bavel, victim of misinformation attacks. And there'll be a whole story about it. And there's a lot of people who've been victimized now. Some politicians are involved, and they shut down the Stanford Internet Observatory because of this. They pressured them and attacked them, and that is gone. And they were like a big place for studying these things. So there's a real thing where a lot of scholars are under attack because this is politically sensitive stuff. And when they contradict powerful people, they get attacked. The next one is, I sense the presentation is based on the assumption that the public would like to know the truth, yet I sense that rational ignorance proposed by Anthony Downs actually exists among us. If we actually use money to incentivize them, doesn't open the door to super PACs to mislead the public into what they believe to be accurate. Yeah, super PACs are already misleading us based on the amount of money going into politics in this country, at least. I don't want to speak for every other political system, but it's bad. People are being manipulated. Propaganda has been around forever. It has been used to mobilize genocides against human beings in all kinds of ways, from Rwanda to Nazi Germany. And so that will always be with us. So I'm doing for everything we can do to fight that. But part of it is figuring out how we can get systems that motivate accuracy, rather that you will always have these systems that are designed to mobilize people for hostility towards minorities, towards keeping certain people and special interests in power. Those will always be here. There's a great book on this I recommend called The Age of Misinformation, I think it's called, by Caitlin O'Connor and James Weatherill. Brilliant book about the history of money leading people to misbelieve things about things like climate change. And the smoking industry did this for decades and killed many people because of spreading confusion and misinformation. So that's been around with us a long time, and we know that playbook, and we're seeing it again with I think with social media and other bad actors. So I think it's good for people to know that, and us for all to be thinking about how can we create better incentives. So my goal is like things like misleading button. Maybe it can be gamed, but I think that's much harder. Getting money out of politics as much as possible and making it a more truer democracy, I think, is also be great. So
thank you
thanks, everybody.
So much. Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you to everybody who connected and who stayed until the end. Remember, you will be able to check this out again and rewatch the webinar at DISD's YouTube channel and on the website. So please check it out and rewatch it and share it if you feel like it. So thank you, Jay, again, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.